Well, thank you, Nancy. I have to say that I began with several others here the sign language course that started this last Monday. I'm not quite up to that level yet, I must say. I can do A. There we go. Well, I'll be honest, when you heard the readings this morning, well, first of all, I had to laugh at the swell. Sorry for that for that misspelling there, but it does kind of make sense a little bit. How many of you pictured Jesus, the Good Shepherd, looking something like this? Well, it's the immediate image that comes to mind for many of us, and I have to add that there's really nothing inherently wrong with it, really. The image is pervasive all throughout Christianity. I mean, I saw it on my trip to Ireland in one of the churches several years back, and I've seen it in California in a hotel of all places, and when I lived there. And I've seen it in Mexican churches and in people's homes as I have visited church folk, And I've seen it growing up as a child, and I've seen it for sale in Michael's as a paint-by-number set. I mean, it's everywhere. As well as this one. You've seen that one too? Well, of course, there's a lot missing from these kinds of pictures. For a shepherd who's supposed to be sleeping and working outside, there's a surprising lack of dirt. He doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who would smell like sheep, manure, and body odor. And I wouldn't expect to see him trudging through the rocky Palestinian hills in search of a patch of grass with a bunch of stubborn sheep. I almost see him instead walking through a field of wildflowers, with happy, frolicking lambs bouncing around him as music swells in the background. In fact, I'm not sure I'd trust this guy as a shepherd. He looks too much to me like a guy who'd be any good at this hard, scruffy job of a shepherd. But we see these images of Jesus as this doe-eyed good shepherd cuddling a tiny helpless lamb or carrying one over his shoulders, and it's comforting and nostalgic, and it's a very peaceful image for us. And we immediately begin to think of Psalm 23, perhaps, of never wanting for anything, of having a banquet table prepared for us in the presence of our enemies, of still waters and green pastures. It's an image of gentle power, of someone who can control the uncontrollable in our world. And isn't that what we want of Jesus? We want Jesus to tame what's wild and unruly in the world, who, with the crook of his staff, can solve what's unsolvable and answer what's unanswerable in life, who can protect and defend us against the thieves and the bandits of this world, who come only to steal, kill, and destroy. Well, regardless of what we want, though, we eventually come face to face with the reality that this world is still wild and unruly, and that there are still questions without answers, and there are still thieves and bandits in the world bent on destruction. I mean, our own church community came face to face with this reality last week when a man stood protesting outside our parking lot, shouting hate messages, and then went on to stand out in front of Trinity Lutheran in Cyrus and at First United Methodist, First Lutheran in Morris here, to do the same thing. Sometimes the entire global or national community has come face to face with this reality as it did when the Islamic State began to execute innocent victims, as it did when the bodies of refugees fleeing violence and poverty washed up on Libyan and Mediterranean shores, or as it has when young black men in our own country continue to be killed by police with alarming frequency. I mean, where was the Good Shepherd in the midst of all this? In the midst of kidnappings and shootings and executions? In the midst of violence against people of color in our own streets, in the midst of hatred in our own backyard and within the church itself? Where is the shepherd that will sanitize all that is wrong with the world, who will clean up all that's messy and misplaced in our lives? And I asked myself these questions as I read over this text this week, and it struck me that these questions come from a misreading of these Good Shepherd passages in John. Because really, what I was asking for was to live within the walled-off reality of the shepherd. You see, the sheepfold was essentially a secure pen in the wilderness constructed of large stones. It kept the sheep safe and guarded by a gatekeeper while the shepherd was away. And I asked, in the midst of tragedy and all that is bad in the world, where is the shepherd that's supposed to protect us? And I didn't like the answer that the text gave, because it meant I'd gotten the safe and secure image of the shepherd wrong over all these years. You see, it always assumed that the shepherd was leading the flock to safety. But that's not really the case, is it? Instead, the shepherd arrives to the sheepfold and calls the sheep away from the safety of the walled-off pen. And they follow the shepherd. Not to safety, but to the open wilderness, because that's where the shepherd always is. The shepherd isn't in the sheepfold. The shepherd is beyond its boundaries, beyond the walls, beyond a safe place of safety and comfort. And the shepherd comes to drive out his sheep from safety into a pasture where there is abundant life. And abundant life is not necessarily a safe life, mind you. Out beyond the sheep pen, there is most certainly green pasture and still waters, but there are also roaming predators, wolves and bandits. There's also a valley shadowed by death. Now, it's not just our images of the shepherd that we've sanitized and cleaned up. We've done it to our text as well. We sheepishly say that Jesus simply brings out all his own from the sheep pen. But the Greek is so much more interesting. The verb used here is actually the same exact verb the gospel writers use to describe the violent casting out of demons. Ekbalo. The shepherd casts out his sheep from the safety of the pen. And suddenly these sheep who have heard the shepherd's voice are quite literally outcast. And in the Gospel of John's historical context, this makes sense. Written the latter half of the first century and after the destruction of the temple by Roman military forces, John's Gospel is set amidst an intense conflict within Judaism, which resulted in the expulsion of Jewish Christians from the synagogue, according to William Herzog II, a scholar of the New Testament. In other words, like the sheep in the story, early followers of Christ were cast out from the safety of the sheepfold. So this text could very well have offered comfort to these Jews, these outcast Jews who followed Christ, by reminding them that Jesus was outside the sheepfold, and that all they had to do was continue to follow his voice to find good pasture to restore their souls. Still, it must have been terrifying and painful to leave the safe sanctuary of faith of their fathers and their mothers. It must have hurt to have the doors of the religious institution shut in their faces because of their beliefs. It must have been incredibly disorienting to feel like they no longer belonged in the faith, that they birthed their own new faith. Did you know that this is the feeling of many of our teenagers and our college students and even community members? It's the feeling that they experience on a weekly basis. In a town dominated by evangelicals and conservatives, our students and thousands across the country and even in the world are often told that they're going to go to hell for what they belong to or for their beliefs, and that, in fact, they don't even belong to the Christian family in the first place. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've had people tell me of a friend or a classmate who told them that they weren't real Christians because they didn't believe in the infallible inerrancy of the Bible, or because we baptize infants, or because we take a more holistic view of salvation, or because the preachers wear funny clothes, or even that I, a local pastor in the Methodist Church, am not a true Christian because I haven't attended a 3-year seminary, or because I am a woman. Even by my own peers, I am told this. For many of our students, if they voice their religious beliefs, they feel cast out, of the religious security, of belonging among their friends and at school. And over the past several years, they've actually helped me to see this hidden way that they are marginalized and made to feel less than at school. And I've watched these students and even my family members suffer because they have close friends disparage their faith as false or heretical. And yet they remain faithful to their beliefs and to their community because they feel loved and valued. And they serve in the liturgy and in the worship, and they serve in the kitchen, and they serve in mission projects with their friends and their churches and their communities. And as a matter of fact, just thinking about them this week helped me to actually plan the sermon. And so I sat down with 2 high school kids this week, and given their experiences in high school, they wanted me to make sure that they conveyed this message. The Good Shepherd is good not because he fixes everything, but because he lays down his life for everyone, for those who fit in and for those who don't, for those who stay in the sheep pen and for those who are outcast. In fact, as we read this text, these students say that they most identified with those other sheep that do not belong to the flock, but nevertheless belong to Christ anyway. Those other sheep that don't belong to this fold, Jesus says. We began to talk, and I asked them to name all those other sheep in the community and in our culture, all those who don't fit into the dominant society and culture here. The people most in our community wouldn't consider normal, but still belong to Christ and hear his voice. And they answered with a litany of outsiders, GLBTQ people, liberals, people experiencing poverty, those suffering from mental illness, the drug addicts, the tattooed people, the African Americans, the young people, the old people, the people looking for jobs, Latinos, people who didn't grow up here, visitors, and yes, the UCC folk and the Methodists too. Well, how does it make us feel to be thrown into a group with this list? I mean, do we feel like we belong with them? Are these our kind of people? Because if we don't belong, then something's wrong with our spirituality. After talking with these kids, I kept coming back to the image of Jesus casting out the sheep from the sheep pen and calling them out to the pasture in the wilderness. And I kept thinking about how often in the Gospels Jesus breaks bread with the outcasts and those society considered sinners. And I kept thinking how often Jesus held these outsiders up as examples of profound faith, how Jesus chose the despised to befriend. And I kept thinking about how Jesus says that whenever we see the hungry, the poor, the lonely, the disenfranchised, the outcast, we are seeing Jesus himself. And then I began to wonder if when we hear the voices of those outcasts in our society, those disenfranchised and marginalized, if we hear that voice for what it really is, the voice of Jesus, the voice of the shepherd, calling us out from the safety of the sheepfold to be a flock of the cast out. I saw a video this week, and I actually posted it on my Facebook page, and it's a commercial from Denmark. And if you haven't seen it, I'd like to show it to you now. Let's just watch it. It might take a couple seconds to get it up here, but let's just watch it.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual, and we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life, and we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. All that we share.
Pretty powerful. You know, I'm not suggesting we sell all our possessions and give them to the poor, though Jesus does. And I'm not suggesting that we hold our possessions and money in common so that none among us will be in need, though that's how Acts says the early church functioned. And I'm not suggesting we need to spend more time among the outcast and marginalized because it makes us good people and better Christians to serve those in need or lend a helping hand. To do so would miss the point of being cast out of the safety of the sheep pen. The point is not to do what is right or to help others out. The point is simply to be where the shepherd is. And the shepherd isn't in the sheep pen. And so perhaps we do all have more in common than we think. You know, as Lilla Watson, an Aboriginal woman in Australia, explained to well-intentioned folk coming to help the outcast here, if you come here to help me, you are wasting our time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's the point. That in some way this boundary-crossing shepherd is calling us to the idea that our liberation, our salvation, is tied up with the salvation and liberation of all people. And that's why the shepherd comes to the sheep pen and calls us out into a wild pasture, because that is where salvation, abundant life, is waiting. Let us pray. O loving shepherd, you lead us along right paths and you give us abundant life. And still we resist your call. We want to be in control. We wish to determine our own direction. Forgive us when we ignore your voice and turn away, and bring us back into your fold through the gates of your redeeming love, out into the pastures. Amen.